Hey there, and welcome to Project Build, where today I want to be showing you how I made this privacy fence with hidden gates. Basic idea of this fence is we got two top rails that sandwich pickets as they go down. We're going to have a 2x4 that goes across the whole top, kind of gives the whole thing rigidity. And down we have two more rails at the bottom. See, we have these brackets here that sandwich around here, and this is how we're attaching it to the actual 4x4. So you can see we already built one section here. Really happy with how this turned out. So let's show you how to build it. After measuring everything and figuring out this first section, we made a template here so we could quickly mark everything on all the other posts. Should save a lot of time. So using our template, we can mark the locations of all the different brackets and the top rail here. We'll just go ahead and do that. I'm kind of eyeballing it because I mean it's a fence and it doesn't have to be perfect. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. What we want to do now is take our speed square and just continue those lines over. So now we take our brackets and we put them up to the lines. I learned later to put the brackets a 1/4 inch or so below the top line, as that top edge of the bracket that's furthest from the post can interfere with the 2x4 rail on a section that slopes downhill. Okay, back to it. I'm kind of just eyeballing this, really just putting it in the center. I'm just going to take pencil and mark 3 holes into drill. So I'm pre-drilling the holes for the nails and then putting the nails in using an auto hammer, which is definitely not a necessary tool to have, but it's kind of fun to use sometimes. So I could have chosen to use screws to put these brackets on, and I didn't just because they're more expensive than nails. But if I had to do it again, I probably would use screws just because of how much time I would have saved, so I didn't have to pre-drill all the holes and then put all the nails in, because that was very time consuming. With all the brackets up, it was time to put up the cross rail. To put up a cross rail, we would push one end all the way up to the post and then mark the other end where it needed to be cut off. I would usually cut these a little long and then come back and recut them as necessary. To mount the rails to the brackets, I'd put a screw in each end, but not all the way through so it didn't interfere with the pickets on the other side. And once the pickets were up covering where those screws were, I'd come back and drive them in all the way and then put in the rest of the screws for the brackets. To put up a picket, I'd put it up against the rails, mark a line at the edge of the top rail, and then cut it off slightly past that line on the miter saw so that the picket would end up being shorter than the height of the top rail. To put the pickets up, I'm screwing them in with 2 screws going through each rail into each picket. I'm doing it in a lower left to upper right pattern so that when I do that same pattern on the other side, I'm not going to run the risk of hitting any of the screws I put in. I'm only marking and cutting them one at a time here, but in future sections I would mark 3 at a time and then cut them all at once, and it sped things up a little bit. And look who decided to visit and then run away, because pickets are clearly very scary. Now I'm just continuing to do more of the same, which gives me a good chance to talk about a few things I haven't yet. I didn't for this section, but in future sections I would drive the screws for the lower 2 rails on the outside of the fence in as I would put up every new picket. It was really hard for me to figure out where those screws went if I put up all the pickets first and then drove the screws in from the front. Another thing I haven't mentioned is the spacing of my rails. I have them set so that the top of the bottom rail is 6 inches off the ground and that the middle rail splits the difference between the top and bottom rails. So there's an equal distance from the top of the bottom rail to the bottom of the middle, from the top of the middle to the bottom of the top. This spacing is dependent on the height of your fence and the thickness of your rails. All right, now we got all the pickets up. We got to do this last one. It's not quite as wide as a normal picket, and it's not quite the same width at the top and the bottom. So we can actually slide this last picket into place and get it as far over against this post as we can. What that lets us do is draw this line on the back here, get a decent guideline of where we actually want to cut this out. And I'm just ripping the picket using my portable circular saw, following the line that I made, and this is plenty accurate enough for an outdoor fence. We went ahead and put the top rail on the other side and screwed in the brackets everywhere. So now what we need to do is cut the top rail up here. Now I wish that I could say the posts were at 90 degrees, but they're not. So what we're going to do is take what's called an angle finder or an angle gauge and put it up here. We put the one edge flush with the edge of this rail here, and then we put the other edge up on here, and it tells us the angle here. So what we read is 93, so it means we got about a 3-degree angle to cut. So we'll go set that on the miter saw and cut the one end of the rail here. I put the cut side of the top rail against the post and then mark the other side. I then measured the angle both ways to know what to set my miter saw to. I cut each one of these top rails too long at first, just to make sure I got the angles right. This was especially important on slopes, as those often had compound angles. I'd come back and recut the rail to the right length once I was sure that it was right. Now I'm toe screwing the top rail to the post. I pre-drilled and put in three 3-inch toe screws on each side, one from the top and one from each side of the rail. I'd also drive a screw in straight down into the fence section, spaced about every 3 pickets apart. So we got one section completely done. Now we just got to do about 20 more of them. So let's get to it. Alright, so after a whole ton of work, that fence is pretty much done on the back here. You guys probably noticed that we didn't do this section yet. And there's a reason for that. We originally intended for this fence to come just straight across here, but when we were building it, this lower part here, this cross piece actually hit the tree here, and well, wouldn't work. So what we're gonna do is box it in like we did over there with that tree. And we'll put a box around it, and that'll give the tree room to grow so we don't ever have to worry about that being a problem. Yeah, let's do that. And there you go. With the fence done around the side and back of the house, we have to do the front sections on either side of the house where it closes off the front and ties into the side of the house. We'll also put a gate in the middle here. And we'll do one on each side so we have the ability to get through on both sides. So we're going to go ahead and do these 2 side sections here, and these will be just like the ones you've seen already. So let's do that. And there we go. All right, so both those sections done. That leaves the gate. So I've been thinking about how I want this gate to actually look since we started building the fence. I think I have the general idea. I want the outside of the fence and the front of the gate to basically look like the rest of the fence. So from the outside, you won't really be able to tell it's a gate unless you get real close. And then from the inside, it'll look like this. And then there'll be some hardware that you can see on the inside. So it's the general idea. Still gonna have to kind of figure it out as we go. So should be fun. What I think we're gonna do is build this gate freeform and then trim it to size with a circular saw and a straight edge later. So what I've done is I've cut these 3 cross sections so that they're slightly shorter than they need to be to span this gap, and then we'll build a gate, basically a freestanding section. Challenges we're going to face is that this is actually on a slope, so everything's going to have to be sloped at the top and bottom, and that these posts aren't perfectly level, so this gate is actually narrower at the top than it is at the bottom, but we'll figure it out. I'm starting the gate by putting up a few scrap pieces of the pickets here. I have these set back so that the cross piece will be in line with the cross pieces on the other sections. So now I'm attempting to put up the cross piece and quickly realizing that I need help for this. Hello there. I drove a screw into each end of each cross piece, and then once those were held up, I got some scrap boards that were long enough to span all 3 cross pieces and drove 2 screws into each one to hold the shape of the gate in place. I learned the hard way that I needed 2 screws in each one, as I only put one in the first time, and then the whole thing pivoted and I had to come back and redo this entire step. So don't do that. I laid out a bunch of pickets on the garage floor that were wider than the skeleton frame is, and then I laid that skeleton frame down on top of it. From there, I lined up the gate frame how I wanted it to be, and then I screwed in the ends so that it would stay in place. I then went and removed these scrap pieces that were holding our frame in position, as I no longer needed them, and then I screwed through the cross rails, putting 2 screws into each picket, just like any other section would be. Once everything was screwed together, I got a straight edge so that I could mark a line on the edge of the gate at the ends of each cross section so that I would know where to cut it off. And then I used the straight edge to mark lines on the other side as well. I don't show it, but I also marked a line flush with the top rail because I need to take that off and cut it slightly below. I took the gate outside and put it on sawhorses so I could cut all around it. Took off the top rail and then cut slightly below that line so that none of the pickets would stick up beyond the top rail. Then I started trimming the sides of the gate but I had to stop once I reached the cross sections as those were in the way. Then I screwed the top rail into place, putting in all the screws as there were only 2 on each end holding it in before. Now I needed to cut off the bottom of the gate slightly above the level of the ground. I measured it, and the distance from the bottom rail to the ground varied from about 3 1/4 to 3 1/2 inches. So I made a mark at 3 inches on each side, drew a line, and then I moved the straight edge so that it was offset the correct distance from my circular saw, and then cut off all the pickets so that they ended up being 3 inches below the edge of that bottom cross piece. I needed to finish trimming the edges of the gate, and this was made difficult because the cross pieces are raised up higher than the pickets are. So I got a couple of scrap pieces of pickets and I clamped them in place so that I was able to cut continuously across that section. With everything trimmed up, basically have a gate now. Woo! So now I needed to put the gate up. The idea was to put up scrap blocks so that the gate would stand freely in place. I did this by stacking together 4 pieces of wood so I could get the right offset so that the gate section would remain in place in line with the other sections. I got a few pieces of scrap to wedge under the gate just to lift it up so that the top edge was even with the others. The gate sections sit back from the edge of the post a little bit, so I added a few pieces so that the hinges would have a flush surface to mount across. I then leveled and screwed in my 3 hinges into the post, but not into the gate yet. To do this, I pre-drilled for the bolts that came with the hinges, and then I used an impact socket on my impact driver to drive in these lag bolts. You could definitely do it with a socket wrench. It was just a lot easier and faster to use an impact socket on the impact driver. Once all the hinges were mounted to the post, I then pre-drilled into the gate and then drove in those 3 lag bolts for each hinge into the gate. Now I needed to add the gate latch. I cut a small section of wood similar to like I did on the hinge side so that the gate latch would be brought out flush with the edge of the post. I mounted the bar for the gate latch, and then I mounted the closing mechanism. So this is an auto latching gate latch. When you close the gate, the latch will automatically hook on and hold the gate closed. You can see this works great, and on the first try too, which I really wasn't expecting. But then it ran into the problem of, how do I open it from the outside? More problems to solve. And no, using a board is not a permanent solution. On the front of the gate, I mounted the cross rail. I screwed in the top rail, this time only screwing down from above. I'm not toe screwing into the posts. Then off camera, I screwed in the pickets from the front. With that, the gate is pretty much done. And you can see it looks just like the other sections. And I'm really happy with how this turned out. Here's our gate, but now what we need to do is create some way to open this gate from the outside. Because currently there is no way to do that here. And the only thing that we can do is reach all the way over and reach that latch that I'm obviously not tall enough to get to. I opened up the gate so I could show you the general idea of how this is going to work. There's this auto closing latch on the back side of the fence here, and a bar that comes in, and then this latch closes down on it. So what we want to be able to do is to pull this open from the other side of the fence. So I have this 1/16 inch galvanized steel cable. What we're going to do is have it come through the fence here, and we're actually going to drill a hole so that it's held up here, and we'll have it come through and go through this loop and then close, and then we'll use a ferrule to hold this closed like this so that you'll be able to pull it from the other side. I'm drilling a hole slightly larger than 1/16 of an inch for the steel cable. I should have put it a little higher than I did here so that the cable pulls mostly vertically on the gate latch and not a little bit to the side. Mine still works, just a possible improvement. Then I fed an end of the wire through the hole and then through one side of the ferrule, through the gate latch, then back through the other side of the ferrule and pulled the loop tight. I then used a pair of end cutting pliers to crimp the ferrule and pulled on the wire to make sure I had crimped it tight enough. They make specialized crimpers for things like this, but I don't own any, so I just used what I had. Then I repeated the same procedure on the other side, but this time I left a larger loop so that I would have something big enough to grab onto. Once everything looked good, I cut the wire off using my end cutting pliers. All right, the pull is done, and you can see our gate is not moving here. It is latched. We just grab this and pull, and boom, we're in. One of the last things we need to do for the fence is to cut all the posts off at the same height and then put a cap on top of the post that looks nice but also protects the post from the elements. So I'm going to be using this copper post cap. There's lots of different options out there. You can just find something that you like, and this will just go on top just kind of like this, but obviously at the right height. So I'm going to be cutting the post off at about 3 inches above this top rail. I could go and measure each post and get the lines all the way around level and then cut it that way, but that would be a lot of work for one post, let alone all the posts that I got to do. Whenever I have something repetitive that I need to do, I usually end up making a jig for it. So I've made a little post jig here, and it's just a 2-inch tall square that'll go over the post like this, and I'll be able to screw it in from here and here once I get it level, and that'll hold it where I want it. My saw blade is offset from this edge a little over 1 inch. When I add it to the 2 inches of this thickness, the post will end up being about 3 to 3.5 inches from the top rail here. I put the jig on the post, I leveled it and screwed it in. I learned that it was better to screw in the side of the jig that was further from level when the jig was just sitting freely first. I cut the post off by running the saw down 2 opposite sides of the post. I let the saw tilt in a little bit here, and it led to a rough edge at the top, but I was able to clean that up later with the reciprocating saw. Now I need to put these copper caps on the post. I'm going to use an exterior grade construction adhesive to attach this to the top of the post. To make that adhere best, take an old paintbrush and clear away any sawdust. And this copper is really smooth and shiny. Well, I need to sand it a little bit, so I give the construction adhesive a rough surface to bond to. If you can see there, I roughed it up. I used 120 grit sandpaper. Just make sure you rough it up a little bit. I want to put the construction adhesive on the post cap. I'm gonna apply it to this inner corner here. And then take the cap and put it in place and press it down. That's all there is to it. So that's it for the fence. I'm so happy with how this turned out, especially these gates. Like, those are pretty awesome. If you have any questions about any of the materials or tools that I've used, I've listed everything in the description below. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and let me know what you thought in the comments section. And if you're not subscribed, go ahead and do that too, so that you won't miss any of the stuff that I'm going to be building in the future. So thanks for watching. I'll see y'all later. And I'm just going to start these nails. Well, I like that. And what it is, it's just a 2 inch watt tall.